My brother demanded gifts, tuition, and even a car, bragging, "I don't pay for anything. Dad does." He sold that financed car for $100, ruined Dad's credit, and abandoned me at a station. Dad finally cut him off. Now he's collapsing. Hey everyone, figured I'd finally sit down and write this out. I've told bits and pieces of this story before in comments, but never the full thing. It's about my younger brother Daniel, who basically grew up thinking the world owed him everything. My parents spoiled him rotten, and for years he coasted on their money and patience, while I had to grind for everything. Anyway, here's how it all started. I grew up in a small town in Ontario, where news traveled faster than the weather. If you skipped class, someone would tell your mom before you even got home. That kind of place. Our family was well known enough because Dad worked at the paper mill his whole life, and Mom ran the front desk at the library. They weren't rich, but they were respected. Hard-working people, not flashy. There were two of us kids, me, Mark, and my younger brother Daniel. I was older by 4 years, but you wouldn't have known it by the way things worked in our house. From day one, Daniel was treated like royalty. Maybe it's because he was the youngest. Maybe it's because he was charming in that lazy way that makes people forgive things they shouldn't. Whatever it was, Daniel got away with murder while I was expected to set the example. I learned early that if something needed doing, it was on me. Snow shoveling, mowing, errands. While Daniel vanished the second chores came up. Mom and Dad would just tell me to be the bigger person. At 14, that felt less like wisdom and more like punishment. Dad cared a lot about education. He set up RESPs for both of us. But by the time I applied to college, mine had gone to bills. When Daniel applied a few years later, suddenly there was money again. That was the pattern. If there was only enough for one, it was always Daniel. When Daniel turned 16, Dad found him a beat-up Civic and even paid the insurance. At that age, the best I got was borrowing Mom's minivan if I begged. Things are different now, Dad said when I asked. Different always meant better for Daniel. Daniel never took care of that car. Skipped oil changes, drove it rough, left trash all over the inside. When it broke down, Dad paid to fix it. If it got dirty, Mom cleaned it. Meanwhile, I was still biking to work or catching rides with friends until I could save up for my own used truck. The Civic didn't last long. He drove it into the ground, and by the time he was finishing school, it was already junked. By the time he graduated, Daniel had a full ride to a decent university. Well, not a scholarship, but Dad covering everything. Tuition, dorm, books. He'd brag to anyone who'd listen about heading to the city for school. People in town acted like he was going to cure cancer. Nobody asked me about the classes I was paying for at community college after shifts at the store. Small towns love a success story, and Daniel looked like one. The funny thing was, he wasn't successful at all. He was just carried. When he came home on breaks, his paycheck went to jackets and gadgets, while Mom and Dad stretched to cover his tuition. I'll never forget one night when I was 19. I'd been saving for months to buy an old Chevy pickup from a guy I worked with. I finally had almost enough. Daniel, still in high school at the time, dropped by that weekend and saw me counting the cash. He smirked and said, "Why don't you just ask Dad? He'll buy it for you." I told him not everyone could just snap their fingers and get handed a car. He shrugged and said, "Guess you should have been the favorite then." That sentence stuck with me. It was Daniel summed up in one line: smug, entitled, and convinced the world existed to hand him things. And the thing about the town is, people notice. Folks smiled when they saw Daniel in town, sure, but plenty of them whispered too. They knew who was paying his way. They knew who was covering his mistakes. But in our family, you didn't call it out. You kept the peace. So I swallowed it, worked, saved, and watched. Watched my brother get handed things I had to sweat for. Watched my parents stretch themselves thinner and thinner, trying to keep him happy. Watched Daniel's confidence grow, not because he was capable, but because he'd never once been told no. When Daniel got into university, it was like my parents had won the lottery. They told everyone. Cashiers at the grocery store, the mechanic, even the lady at church who already knew, because Daniel bragged to her grandson. I remember standing next to him at the high school graduation ceremony, while Mom cried and Dad patted him on the back like he'd just cured a disease. I was proud too, but mostly I was tired. I knew who was paying for it. The whole deal was set up. Tuition, dorm fees, meal plan, all on Dad's wallet. They said they wanted to give Daniel the chance they never had. I understood that part. But I also knew that every bill Dad paid for Daniel meant less saved for retirement, less for emergencies. At that time, Dad was already close to 60 and working longer shifts at the mill to make sure Daniel had his shot. Daniel went off to Toronto and instantly became the uni prince. He lived in residence, had a new laptop, and enough allowance from dad to keep him comfortable. When classes ended for the year, Daniel came back home. He didn't like staying at our house because he didn't want to follow mom's rules. So he'd split his time between there and his girlfriend Sarah's place. Sarah was nice enough when I met her, but she didn't work either. Her parents helped her out, and with Daniel freeloading on them too, they stretched thin. That didn't stop the two of them from getting pregnant. I'll never forget how my parents reacted when Daniel announced Sarah was expecting. Instead of shock or panic, they smiled and said, "Well, we'll make it work." That was the difference between me and him. If I'd come home with news like that, I would have been told to figure it out myself. But Daniel? He got hugs, promises of support, and a bunch of people talking about how responsible he'll become now. When their son Kyle was born, Daniel acted like he'd unlocked a new achievement in life. He told Dad he needed more money for diapers, formula, gas. Somehow, even though he had a part-time retail job, he never had enough. He worked at a clothing store in town during breaks from school. The paycheck should have helped with bills, but he used it for himself. New shoes, gadgets, food for him and Sarah when they went out. Not a dime went toward groceries at home, and he never offered mom or dad rent. One summer afternoon, I overheard him talking to Sarah in the backyard. He was telling her that when he graduated, he was going to ask Dad to buy them a car so they could start fresh. I almost laughed out loud. Ask Dad? Dad was nearing retirement. He'd already burned through most of my RESP to pay Daniel's last year of tuition. But Daniel didn't see the problem. He thought being a parent automatically entitled him to more help. Sure enough, after graduation day came, Daniel started dropping hints. That day was a circus. Our extended family came over, gifts piled up, cash in envelopes, a new watch from mom, a gold chain from dad. Everyone congratulated him like he'd run a marathon. He'd worked for that degree, sure, but so had the rest of us by proxy. Without dad's long shifts and mom's budgeting, Daniel wouldn't have finished. Later that night, he pulled dad aside and said he needed a car. Not wanted, needed. He said Kyle deserved a safe ride, and it was the least we could do. That line made my blood boil. The least we could do? Dad had just spent years keeping him afloat. But Daniel played the baby card, and Dad's heartstrings were easy to pull when it came to his grandson. Still, Dad hesitated. He told Daniel he couldn't just buy him a car outright. Retirement wasn't far away, and he'd already drained savings. Daniel didn't care. He pushed. He said without a car, he couldn't work more hours, couldn't support Kyle properly. Finally, Dad caved halfway. He said he would co-sign a loan if Daniel found something affordable and reasonable. That way, Daniel could build his credit and still get the car. It was supposed to be a compromise. A week later, Daniel showed off the Geo Metro they'd found. A small, no-frills car. Price tag, about $3,000. Dad went with him to sign papers at Daniel's bank. The agreement was simple. Daniel would pay around $50 every 2 weeks. Nothing huge. But the catch was clear. If Daniel didn't pay, Dad was on the hook. Dad told him straight up, miss a payment, and it would ruin Dad's credit. Daniel nodded like he understood, swore up and down he'd be responsible. For the first couple of months, things looked fine on the surface. Daniel drove the Metro everywhere. He bragged to friends about finally being independent, about how he was managing on his own now. Sarah rode around with Kyle in the back, posting about their car like they'd achieved something. I wanted to believe he was actually stepping up. Maybe the baby and the loan would make him grow up. Maybe this was the point where he'd finally stand on his own 2 feet. Then, the cracks started showing. One afternoon, the phone rang while Dad was at work. I picked it up, and the guy on the other end said he was calling from Daniel's bank. Our family had always used Bank One, but Daniel had his account at Bank Two, so I knew right away it had something to do with him. The banker, bound by privacy rules, wouldn't say much to me, but he slipped up just enough that I realized it was about the car loan. My stomach sank. I told the guy Dad would call back, hung up, and waited until Dad got home. When I told him, his jaw tightened. He didn't even sit down, just grabbed his keys and went straight to the branch. When he came back, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in an hour. He slammed the front door, muttered under his breath, and finally said what happened. But behind the scenes, Daniel hadn't made a single payment on the loan. Not one. 2 months had gone by, and not a dime had gone to the bank. That night, Dad called Daniel. I'd never seen him so furious. He told him he had put his own credit on the line, trusted him, and Daniel hadn't even tried to hold up his end. Daniel immediately started backpedaling. He swore he was going to catch up, that he just forgot the first payment, then didn't have the money for the second, but he had it now. He promised to go to the bank first thing the next morning. Dad told him if it happened again, there would be consequences. That was the end of the call. Mom tried to calm him down afterward, saying Daniel was just overwhelmed with being a new parent. Dad shook his head. He wasn't buying it, but he gave Daniel one more chance because of Kyle. For a short time, it seemed like Daniel actually listened. He made a couple of payments, drove the metro around town like he was king of the road, and even bragged that he was on top of things now. If you didn't know the full story, you'd think he'd turned a corner. But Daniel was predictable. 3 months later, the phone rang again. This time, the banker asked for Dad directly. Same issue. Late payments. Dad hung up, grabbed the phone again, and called Daniel. This time, the conversation didn't stay calm. Dad told him point blank he wasn't responsible enough to keep the car. He told him to bring it over to the house so I could take over the payments. That way, the loan would still get covered, and at least the car would be with someone who could handle it. I wasn't thrilled about inheriting Daniel's mess, but it was better than watching Dad's credit get trashed. When Dad demanded the car back, Daniel dropped the kind of line that makes your head spin. He said, "I don't have it anymore." Dad froze. "What do you mean you don't have it?" Daniel, completely casual, said the brakes went out, and the repair shop quoted him $400. He didn't have that kind of cash, so instead of asking for help or working extra shifts, he offloaded the car. Not through a dealer, not with the bank's sign-off, but to some guy down the road for $100 in cash. It wasn't even a proper sale. The bank still held the lien, which meant legally the car wasn't his to sell. I'll never forget the silence that followed. Dad was gripping the phone so hard his knuckles went white. When he finally spoke, his voice shook. He told Daniel he'd just dumped a car he didn't even fully own, leaving Dad tied to the loan with nothing to show for it. Daniel didn't see the problem. He actually argued back. He said, "Why should I keep paying for a car I don't even have anymore?" Like it was logical. Dad lost it then. He told Daniel he was selfish, irresponsible, and had crossed a line. He said from that moment on, he was done helping him financially. Daniel tried to spin it again, blaming the brake shop for ripping him off, blaming the bank for being too strict, even blaming Dad for pressuring him into the loan in the first place. He took responsibility for nothing. At the end of the day, Dad still had no choice. He was co-signer. The bank didn't care about Daniel's excuses. They wanted their money. So Dad ended up paying off the rest of the loan himself. For the next year, money that should have gone into retirement instead went to cover Daniel's $100 scrap sale. The next morning, Dad went back to the bank to figure out his options. There weren't many. As co-signer, he was on the hook no matter what. The loan had to be paid whether the car existed or not. So Dad set up automatic payments from his account. Month after month, he covered Daniel's mess, while Daniel carried on like nothing had happened. At home, you could feel the shift. Mom still defended Daniel here and there, saying he was young and stressed with the baby. But Dad was done making excuses. He started warning both of us about credit, about responsibility, about how long it took to rebuild trust once it was broken. The speeches were aimed at Daniel, but half the time, Daniel wasn't even there to hear them. Meanwhile, Daniel had no shame. He'd roll up to the house in Sarah's parents' car, acting like life was fine. He'd complain about his job, brag about new sneakers, and then ask Mom to watch Kyle so he and Sarah could get some time to themselves. Dad would grit his teeth but rarely said no when it came to the baby. That was the only thing keeping the bridge from burning completely, the fact that Kyle was innocent in all of this. One evening, Dad sat me down in the garage. He said, "Mark, I'm done financing your brother's life. He's on his own now. I should have done it years ago." He admitted using my education savings to cover Daniel's tuition, admitted he thought Daniel just needed one more chance to straighten out, and those bills and repairs were just a cover. But this car situation proved it wasn't about chances anymore. It was about choices. Daniel always chose the easy way, and the family always paid for it. The resentment started to spread outside our walls too. People in town began to notice the cracks in Daniel's image. Everyone had heard about him selling the metro for scrap while his dad still covered the payments. The proud university graduate with a family quickly became the guy who dumped his car for $100 and left his dad stuck with the loan. I'd run into people at the store who'd shake their heads and say, "Heard about your brother. Tough break for your dad." I'd nod, embarrassed, even though I had nothing to do with it. That was the frustrating part. Daniel made the mess, but the Dawson name took the hit. Quick pause, fellas. YouTube just dropped this new hype feature. If you're hooked on this story, smash that hype button. It tells YouTube this video deserves to blow up, and it keeps even crazier stories coming your way. Thanks so much for your support. All right, back to the drama. For Dad, The loan dragged on for almost a year. Each month he sent in the payment, knowing full well Daniel was never going to step up. Every time the bank withdrew money, it was a reminder that he'd been burned by his own son. By the time the balance was cleared, Dad's trust in Daniel was completely gone. The final straw for Dad wasn't even the money. It was Daniel's refusal to take any responsibility. He never apologized, never offered to pay back even part of what he owed. He acted like it was ancient history before the debt was even paid off. If you brought it up, he'd shrug and say, "That was a bad situation. Let's move on," like he was the victim. From then on, things at home changed permanently. Daniel was no longer welcome to ask for financial help. Dad told Mom and me flat out, "That gravy train is over." And he even said it in front of Daniel once when Daniel asked about borrowing money for emergencies. Dad told him, "You already had your emergency. You sold it for $100. That was the first real boundary Dad had ever set with him. And Daniel hated it. He sulked, argued, tried to guilt-trip Mom, but Dad didn't budge. It was the first time I'd seen Dad hold his ground completely. But even with the car gone, Daniel wasn't finished burning bridges. The worst incident was still ahead. It had nothing to do with banks or cars. It had to do with me, a train station, and the day he proved he wasn't just irresponsible, he was cruel. That summer, I was working at the hardware store full-time. On top of that, I slipped on a ladder while unloading stock and wrecked my ankle. Crutches for 6 weeks. Getting around was a nightmare. Buses weren't reliable in town, and I had to rely on rides from family whenever I couldn't manage on my own. I hated it, but there wasn't much choice. One Saturday, I had to catch the train back from a nearby city where I'd gone for a checkup. It was about a 30-minute ride, and I timed it so I'd get back in the afternoon. I called Daniel the night before and asked if he could pick me up from the station. He had Dad's car that weekend because Sarah's parents had borrowed theirs, and he said it wouldn't be a problem. "Yeah, I'll swing by." "No big deal," he told me. So I didn't arrange backup. That was my mistake, trusting him. The train ride itself was fine, but when I got off, Daniel wasn't there. I waited outside with my crutches, checking my watch, watching other people get picked up. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I called him. He answered, sounding annoyed. "Yeah, what?" he said. "I'm at the station." "Where are you?" "Oh, right, can't. I'm heading to the mall with Sarah." I thought I'd misheard. "What? You literally promised me you'd pick me up." "Relax," he said. "The mall's only half an hour away. You can figure something out." "Daniel, I'm on crutches. I can't just figure something out." "Well, I can't cancel plans just because you can't walk." "Not my problem, man. Gotta go." He hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at the screen like it might explain how my own brother could leave me stranded like that. Cars pulled in and out, families reunited, and I was stuck on the bench, balancing on crutches with my leg throbbing. It wasn't just the inconvenience, it was the cruelty. He had the car. He was literally driving past our street to get to that mall. He could have picked me up in 10 minutes and then gone on with his day. Instead, he chose to leave me sitting there like an idiot. After about 40 minutes, I gave up waiting and called Mom. She was furious when she found out. She dropped everything, drove down, and picked me up herself. The whole ride back, she kept shaking her head and muttering, "I can't believe he did this." When we pulled into the driveway, Dad was already home. Mom told him what happened before I even got inside. Dad's face went stone cold. He didn't yell right away. He just went into the living room, sat down, and waited. Daniel strolled in about an hour later with shopping bags in his hands and Sarah trailing behind. He looked completely relaxed, like nothing had happened. Dad stood up and asked, "Where were you?" Daniel smirked. "At the mall." "Why?" Dad's voice stayed calm, but there was a sharp edge. "Why did you leave your brother at the station? He's on crutches. You promised him a ride." Daniel rolled his eyes. "I had plans. He could have figured it out. He's not a kid." That was it. Dad exploded. He shouted so loud the windows rattled. He said, "I've worked myself into the ground for you, and you can't even give your brother a ride when he's injured? You don't deserve this roof over your head." For once, Mom didn't defend him. She sat there with her arms crossed, glaring. Sarah tried to step in, saying Daniel didn't mean it, but Dad shut her down instantly. "Stay out of this." He knew what he was doing. Daniel fired back, calling Dad unfair, accusing me of making a big deal out of nothing. He said, "You guys act like I owe you my whole life just because you paid for school. I don't." That was the final nail. Dad pointed at the door and told him to pack his stuff. "You want to act like you don't owe this family anything? Fine. Don't live here." Daniel stormed upstairs, grabbed his clothes, and left with Sarah that night. No hugs, no apologies, no second thoughts. He didn't even look at Kyle's grandparents as he walked out. The house was quiet after he left, but it wasn't sad quiet. It was relief, like a weight finally lifted. For the first time, Dad admitted out loud what we all knew. Daniel was never going to change. From that day on, Daniel never lived under our roof again. He'd show up now and then, asking for help or trying to smooth things over. But Dad stood firm. He was cut off. The bank loan, the car, the station incident. It was all too much. At first, Daniel acted like leaving was his idea. He told people around town that he was moving on with his own life and cutting ties because we were too controlling. Everyone already knew about the car loan mess. Everyone had heard whispers about him, leaving me stranded at the station. For the first time, the golden boy image started to crack. Reality hit Daniel faster than he expected. Without Dad's money, he had to rely on whatever he could earn from retail jobs. The problem was, he never stayed anywhere long. He'd brag about getting hired, then complain 2 weeks later that his boss was toxic, or his coworkers had it out for him. He'd quit before hitting 3 months at most places. With no degree-related job and no steady income, bills piled up. Sarah tried to keep things afloat, but she was just as unprepared. She worked part-time at a diner, and when Daniel's hours dried up, she ended up covering most of the rent. They moved 3 times in 2 years, each place smaller and rougher than the last. From a half-decent apartment to a basement suite, and finally to a rundown rental house that smelled like mold. Their relationship started to fray. Sarah was tired of being the only one actually paying bills. Arguments got louder. Once, Mom told me Sarah showed up at the library with Kyle, nearly in tears, saying she didn't know how much longer she could put up with him. A year later, she packed up her stuff and left Daniel for good, taking Kyle with her. That was a turning point. Without Sarah, Daniel had no backup. He suddenly had to deal with child support. The government doesn't care about excuses or charm. They garnish your wages if you don't pay. And since Daniel never held a job steady enough, he was constantly behind. His credit tanked even further. Every time he tried to finance anything, furniture, a car, even a phone plan, he got rejected. Meanwhile, he had to rely on buses. In our town, buses weren't frequent, and everyone saw him waiting at stops with the same worn-out jacket. This was the guy who once laughed at me for saving up to buy a used truck. Now he couldn't even borrow a car because nobody trusted him not to trash it. In a town where gossip stuck like glue, Daniel became a punchline. The Metro story turned into shorthand for stupidity. Don't sell your car for scrap like Daniel. At bars, people joked he was the guy who thought a $100 bill was worth ruining his dad's credit. Occasionally, Daniel would try to crawl back. He'd call Mom, asking for a little help until payday. She gave in once or twice, but Dad shut it down quickly. He told her, every time we give him money, we keep him exactly where he is. Eventually, Mom stopped answering his calls too. The few times I ran into him around town, he always had some new story. I'm about to start this new job, it's gonna be big. Or, I'm talking to a buddy about starting a business. None of it ever happened. Next time I'd see him, he'd be back to the same excuses. He looked older than his age, always tired, always broke. Meanwhile, my life was moving in the opposite direction. I stuck with the hardware store for a while, then transitioned into a steady trades job. I saved, built credit, bought a reliable car with my own name on the paperwork. No cosign needed. Later, I managed to get a small place of my own. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. That contrast made things clear to everyone. Daniel had every advantage growing up. Tuition paid, car cosigned, a family willing to cover for him. I had none of that, and yet I moved forward while he spun in circles. People noticed. Relatives who used to fawn over him started making comments to me instead. Mark, you did it the right way. Good on you for building something solid. It felt good, not because I needed validation, but because the truth was finally obvious. The best part was that I didn't have to lift a finger for karma to work. Daniel did it to himself. Every selfish choice, every shortcut, every time he blamed someone else. It all piled up until he was buried under it. By the time he hit his 30s, he was the guy people pitied, not envied. Last I heard, he was renting a room in someone's house, still bouncing between jobs. Sarah had remarried, Kyle was thriving with stability, and Daniel was stuck complaining about how life isn't fair. Nobody in town bought it anymore. They'd shake their heads and say, life gave you chances. You just wasted them. By the time I reached my late 20s, Daniel was a shadow of the guy my parents once bragged about. He had gone from being the first Dawson to graduate university to the guy nobody trusted with a dollar. And while his life unraveled, mine was finally coming together. I stayed in trades after leaving the hardware store. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it paid well enough. I learned to budget, stayed out of debt, and slowly built my credit. I bought my first car outright with my own savings. No cosign, no bank breathing down my neck. That was a proud moment because it was proof I'd done what Daniel never could: stand on my own 2 feet. Dad helped me understand paperwork, loans, and credit reports. After watching him suffer from that car loan Daniel dumped on him, I took every lesson seriously. Within a few years, I managed to get a small mortgage approved and bought a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I planted grass in the backyard, fixed it up bit by bit, and turned it into something solid. Every improvement was a reminder that I'd earned it. Daniel, on the other hand, never left the cycle. His jobs came and went. His reputation was shot. Even people who used to cover for him stopped trying. He became known as the guy who always had a big plan that never happened. Every time he spoke about a new business idea or some friend who was going to hook him up with work, people just nodded politely, already knowing it would collapse in a few weeks. The breakup with Sarah was permanent. She moved on, remarried, and gave Kyle the stable life he deserved. From what I heard, Kyle barely saw his dad except during mandatory visitation. Daniel never showed up prepared. Sometimes he'd forget to bring basic things like snacks or a jacket, and eventually Kyle stopped wanting to visit. Even as a kid, he figured out his father wasn't reliable. That was the harshest punishment Daniel could get. Not from courts, not from money, but from his own son choosing distance. Whenever I ran into Daniel in town, the contrast was glaring. I'd be grabbing groceries with a clear plan for the week. He'd be standing in line with nothing but junk food and beer bread, fumbling for change. He always looked older than he was, worn down, like the choices he made were etched onto his face. He'd sometimes try to spark conversation, saying things like, "We should catch up sometime." But there was nothing to catch up on. His stories were the same. Mine had moved forward. I built a circle of people I could actually rely on. Co-workers, a few close friends, later even a partner who appreciated stability over flash. None of that would have happened if I had wasted years cleaning up after Daniel. That's the thing about letting go of toxic family. You realize how much energy you get back for yourself. Dad never softened on him after the station incident. He'd acknowledge Daniel if they crossed paths. But that was it. No money, no handouts, no second chances. "You made your bed," he told him once, "and I'm not laying in it with you." Mom tried here and there, but eventually even she stopped. The guilt trips, the manipulation, it all wore her down. By the time Kyle was in grade school, Mom admitted I was right. Daniel wasn't going to change. The years passed, and the gap between us only grew wider. I advanced in my trade, took night classes, and eventually landed a supervisor role. I wasn't rich, but I had security. I had savings, a roof that was mine, and the peace of knowing my bills were paid on time. Daniel never had that. He went from couch surfing to sketchy rentals to finally renting a single room in someone's house. People who once envied him now shook their heads and said, "What a waste." The irony is that all the things he laughed at me for, saving money, working steady jobs, buying used cars instead of flashy ones, were the exact things that gave me a stable life. And the things he prided himself on, shortcuts, charm, avoiding responsibility, left him broke, bitter, and alone. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to prove anything. His life became its own warning sign, while mine became the proof that hard work and patience pay off. That's the closure I got. The last time I saw him was outside the grocery store. He gave me a nod, forced a smile, and asked if I could spot him a 20 just until next week. I shook my head. Not happening. He shrugged like he expected that answer and shuffled off. Watching him walk away, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just relief. Because the truth is, I moved on. I stopped measuring myself against him years ago. He chose his path, and I chose mine. And while his path left him stuck, mine led me somewhere worth being. That's the real ending. Daniel's gravy train stopped decades ago, and he never figured out how to stand without it. Meanwhile, I built a life that doesn't depend on anyone's handouts. I don't wake up dreading debt collectors or waiting for pity. I wake up knowing I earned everything I have, and that's enough for me.